person called Clement, and the church as we know it thought that these were false writings, whereas their writings were true. Whereas you and I would put all the little writings on the table, let the public judge for itself, which is false, which is true. But there's a statement in the Pseudo-Clementines attributed to Jesus, where Jesus says, "Be like good money changers, able to tell false coin from true." And I think that's what we want our audiences to do, and that's why we have all this data, to be able to tell false coin from true, and that's where the book of Acts is the battleground.
Your book is a fascinating book, and one of the chapters is actually titled "The Vegetarianism of James," and the viewers of this show are quite aware that one of my own main interests is in the early vegetarian teachings of primitive Christianity. I've asserted on this show numerous times that the earliest Christian movement was vegetarian, and these ancient sources that you've cited that are describing Jesus as having this brother James, and James is the head of the church after him, when they describe James, they describe him as a vegetarian. There's many other early Christian sources that describe this early vegetarian form of Christianity, calling them the Ebionites, the Nazarenes. Much of their terminology is similar to what we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They seem to be an outgrowth of this Judaic Essene movement. But the thing that had caused me a bit of consternation is that even though the source materials were describing Jesus as having a brother James in charge of the church after Jesus' crucifixion, and James was a vegetarian, and then the Clementine manuscript describing Peter as a vegetarian, and Acts of Thomas describing Thomas as a vegetarian, and so many sources on vegetarianism, mainline scholarship has failed, I believe, to take adequate note of that, and that's why I was very pleased to see your book, James the Brother of Jesus, actually have a chapter on the vegetarianism of James. And so I want to ask you a question. You're not related to my church. You're a renowned scholar. Would you agree with my assertion that it seems that James, the brother of Jesus, was a vegetarian, and that there was some sort of a strain of Jamesian Christianity that was indeed vegetarian?
Well, absolutely, you're right there. Certainly all the sources tell us, these are extra-biblical sources primarily, but also reading between the lines of Paul, you can see that James, because Paul, as it turns out, seems to be James's arch nemesis or arch enemy, that you can see that Paul, in fact, that James is a vegetarian. Whether I'm a renowned scholar or not, even your other people, that's a matter of opinion, but anybody, and that's why we put the data out there, can see this. Yes, we have here in this book, as it starts off, we have a lot of background material, source material, and so on. We start off with one chapter of the first appearance of James in Acts. We go into the picture of James in Paul's letters. We go into the election of James to succeed his brother, and then we get into James's Nazaritism, and then his Rechabitism, and his vegetarianism and abstention from blood and so on, and his clothing, which is similar to your clothing habits, linen, and his bathing habits. So we go into all that kind of material, but it is true that from early church sources, they primarily tell us that James was a vegetarian. But not only James. These sources tell us, well, John the Baptist, regardless of the New Testament picture we get of eating locusts, which I don't think is accurate, I think John the Baptist is in the same mold, vegetarian, bathing sort of individual. The Pseudo-Clementine literature, as I told you, it's not a literature that is orthodox. It's actually an opposition Acts. It is the Acts written in the East against the powers of the Western Church. Acts, which presents a different Peter, a different James, same Paul, but a different Peter and a different James. In Acts we can say Peter is Paulinized. There's an episode in Acts where Peter gets a vision of a tablecloth coming down from heaven with, if you know Jewish dietary regulations, all kinds of forbidden food on it. Lobster, shrimp, I suppose, crabs and so on, snails, snakes. And a voice cries out from heaven saying, "Eat, Peter, eat." And Peter in this episode in the book of Acts says, no, I have never eaten any unclean thing. That's probably authentic, that Peter had never eaten any unclean thing. It's the vision of the tablecloth that Paulinizes him. And after the voice cries out 3 times, by the way, the fact that Peter doesn't know that he can eat forbidden foods means that Jesus never taught it, even according to Acts. So Acts trips itself up there by trying to Paulinize it's Peter. It inadvertently tells us the picture of Jesus we have in these scripture can't be authentic. Otherwise, why would Peter need such a vision? But that being aside, Peter then cries out, the voice cries out, eat, Peter, eat 3 times, and Peter says, finally, I have now learned not to call anything unclean or profane, and not to call any man unclean. And then the Roman centurion comes, sending his servant, so that Peter is prepared to visit his household. But the Pseudo-Clementines give us a totally different Peter. That Peter does not eat forbidden foods, does keep away from all unclean things, is a vegetarian, is a daily bather, rises at the sun before dawn and prays. And what a beautiful Peter that is. To me, the information in the Pseudo-Clementines is 10 times more interesting and 100 times more beautiful than the Peter we get in Scripture. Because the Peter in our Scripture, if you look really carefully, we don't have any picture of him at all. He hardly does anything except argue with Jews, and basically what comes out of his mouth is anti-Semitic invective. And it's not a very, very pretty Peter at all. The Peter in the Pseudo-Clementines is absolutely lovely. The only problem is he's not Paulinized, he's Jamesian.
You're hitting on a really significant point. I've asserted in previous shows, and we're asserting tonight, that there was an earliest form of Christianity, this Essene, Ebionite, Nazarene Christianity, which was vegetarian, which was headed by James after the death of Jesus, that there's some early literature, the Clementines and Gospel of the Hebrews, other manuscripts that this group had, which was a sort of a vegetarian form of early Christianity. Obviously, the fact that Christianity did not continue to be vegetarian means that something happened. And my research has pointed to Paul as being the something that happened, and you just referred to Paul as being pictured in this Essene Christian literature, the Clementines, etc., as being the arch nemesis of Peter and James.
Right.
What can you tell us about that? I mean, Paul is considered by most people as the great hero of Christianity, but in this early Essene Christian literature, he's the arch enemy.
He's the arch enemy. He's the Antichrist incarnate. I think that's the way he was viewed he was viewed that way in Palestine. Absolutely, that Paul was viewed as the Antichrist. I think there's a fairly